Hello and welcome to our talk today, Character Virtues for the 21st Century. My name is Márcia Balisciano and I am a founding director of Benjamin Franklin House in London. And we are so pleased that you can join us, particularly at this time, and we appreciate your support. And it's a challenging time for so many around the world, and we are always guided by what might have interested Benjamin Franklin, who said he was born a couple hundred years too soon and something would be made of his passion for technology and innovation. So the fact that we are presenting today via Zoom is something I'm sure he would have welcomed. It is also the first time since we opened on Franklin's 300th birthday in 2006 that the house has been closed to the public. We took that decision reluctantly, but prudently following government advice. So it's a great opportunity for us to step up our digital offerings, of which the talk today is one. And we will be aiming to have a talk a week from some of the colleagues from Benjamin Franklin House and some of the fascinating people in our network. But the theme today is character virtues in the 21st century. That is a picture of Benjamin Franklin House. If you have not visited when we reopen, I do hope that you will visit. It is a grade 1 terrace house, and you can see it's sort of leaning close to its neighbors. And that is because it's a terrace building that was built circa 1730 by the Craven family, for whom the street is named. It was built as a lodging house, and that's how Benjamin Franklin decided to come to the building when he arrived in London in 1757 to be the kind of primary agent for the American colonies, and particularly for Pennsylvania, which was his adopted state. There were some expensive things happening on the home front, like the French and Indian War, and Franklin thought that the Craven family, for whom the street had been named, needed to do more, as well as other British subjects at the time, like the Penn family, who lived very close to this building at Spring Garden, which is where the British Council is today, near Trafalgar Square, to help support the cause of the French and Indian War with some more funds. But during his time in London, it was incredibly rich, and along the way, he becomes the agent not only for Pennsylvania, but for Massachusetts and Georgia, as well as a number of other colonies. So he was kind of the chief diplomat for the colonies at that time. Now, when he arrived, he pursued his love of social life, and that plays to what we do today at Benjamin Franklin House. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of an overview before I got into the subject of Franklin's 13 virtues. So you can see here a picture from our historical experience. So we are really about the story rather than the stuff. We are focused on Benjamin Franklin's rich period in London, when he was indeed making so many contributions to science, invention, diplomacy. We are having an item per space that gives the sense of what the room would have been used for, but we are really using digital technology as well as live performance, sound and visual projection to give that story of Franklin London. In the space that you see in this picture, that is an actress playing Polly, and there is a portrait of Polly, the only one known to have survived. She was the daughter of Franklin's landlady, and today she's a kind of footnote in history, but she played a very key role in Franklin's life, becoming like a daughter to him. And when he dies at his bedside in 1790 is his own daughter, Sally, as well as Polly. All of her descendants became American because of Benjamin Franklin. And when we opened to the public for the first time in 2006, on his 300th birthday, as I mentioned, we had members of the Hewson family who were with us. So Polly had married a young surgeon, and they lived in the house along with Polly's mother for a time. So we have kind of three dimensions of what we do in the house. We have the historical experience. We also have our science center. So our student science center is focused on Franklin's London science. And there you can see an image from our student science center with Benjamin Franklin and his kite and key. That's a Tesla coil that you can see in the image. We show what happens to your Georgian church when it's not protected, it gets zapped. And what Franklin was doing when he went out into a thunderstorm, flying his kite, and determined that lightning was an electrical phenomenon, which led him to develop the lightning rod, which protects the Georgian church. And the St. Paul's Cathedral is the first building in London to have a Franklin lightning rod. So we're focused on science and innovation at the house as well. And we serve about 3,000 school children. We're doing a number of things to benefit our local community. And here's another image which you can see of Polly, because one day a week we're closed to the public and only open to schools on a Tuesday. An illustrator in residence. There's Benjamin Franklin at the top of Craven Street, taking a look at a particularly thundery day. And this is an illumination that we use on our Tuesday free day when children come to the house and experience the children's historical experience. But we also do about 40 public events each year, and so we won't let the coronavirus stop us from trying to deliver as many of those as possible. And I thought it would be interesting to look at Franklin's ideas about good character. Here's an image of Benjamin Franklin. It is by Joseph Wright of Derby from 1782. And in fact, Benjamin Franklin was elected to the Royal Society, which is the preeminent body for science still today, and it was in Franklin's era. And so this is an image that's in their collection, but it's a kind of famous image of Franklin, and there's a number of different versions of this Joseph Wright painting. But he was very interested in how good character could improve the quality of life for individuals and society at large. So I thought it would be interesting to look at his autobiography, where the 13 virtues come from. This is from a version from 1793 of the autobiography, and it's called The Private Life of the Late Benjamin Franklin, originally written by himself and now translated from the French. And it was published in London by J. Parsons. So this is where he decided to tell some of his story. He wrote it at the home of this gentleman that you can see, Jonathan Shipley, who was the Bishop of St. Asaph. The Royal Society of Arts was founded by Jonathan Shipley's brother, William Shipley, and Benjamin Franklin was the first international member. And when he spent his nearly 16 years at Craven Street, Benjamin Franklin took a very active role with the Royal Society. But he became a close friend of Jonathan Shipley, who invited him to come out in late spring of 1771 to St. Asaph in Twyford, outside of London, very beautiful, to spend some time in his home. And they had a kind of shed in the garden, which is where Benjamin Franklin wrote that first part of the autobiography. I think I have a picture here of his daughter, Georgiana Shipley, But when she was a little girl, among her sisters, Benjamin Franklin decided to send as a gift for having had such a peaceful place to start his autobiography, which he did not finish at that time, a squirrel. And they decided to name the squirrel Mungo. And shortly after little Georgiana had received the squirrel, she wrote to Benjamin Franklin to say that it had gotten bitten by the neighbor's dog. And so he took it upon himself to write in 1772 a letter to Georgiana. He says, "Dear Miss, I lament with you most sincerely the unfortunate end of Mungo. Few squirrels were better accomplished, for he had a good education because he had had his wife send it from Philadelphia. He said he had traveled far and seen much of the world." Now, he went on to say that the kind of epitaphs were very flowery in the 18th century. And, if he wanted to do one in that style, he would say something like, "Learn hence, ye who blindly wish for more liberty, whether subjects, sons, squirrels, or daughters, that apparent restraint may be real protection." Because if the squirrel had stayed close to the home of the Shipleys, it might not have gotten bitten and met its end. But Franklin came up with another epitaph in the same letter, saying it was far better to do a shorter one. So he said, "Here, Scug, lies snug as a bug in a rug." So if you were wondering ever where that came from, that was Benjamin Franklin. So he ostensibly is writing his autobiography to his son. And on our historical experience, we have as a very dramatic part of our story the relationship with his son, William. So Franklin had 3 children that we know of. He had his son, William, who, by the way, was illegitimate. Benjamin Franklin was very good at keeping secrets. He never revealed who William's mother was, so we don't know. But William accompanied him in 1757 when he came, as I mentioned before, initially as that agent for Pennsylvania. And William was educated at Temple Bar in London and became the royal governor of New Jersey. So Franklin was extremely proud of his son. And he's writing to his son about his life. But actually, Benjamin Franklin might be considered the ultimate master of public relations in the 18th century, because really it's what he wanted to curate from his life and tell us about. So you see, he says, "I have ever had pleasure in obtaining any little anecdotes of my ancestors. You may remember the inquiries I made among the remains of my relations when you were with me in England, and the journey I undertook for that purpose. Imagining it may be equally agreeable to you to know the circumstances of my life, many of which you are yet unacquainted with, and expecting the enjoyment of a week's uninterrupted leisure in my present country retirement," I'm interjecting here with the Shipleys, "I sit down to write them for you, to which I have besides some other inducements. Having emerged from the poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation in the world, and having gone so far through life with a considerable share of felicity, the conducing means I made use of, which with the blessing of God so well succeeded, my posterity might like to know, as they may find some of them suitable to their own situations, and therefore fit to be imitated." And of course, that's rather relevant when he goes back to work on the second part of his autobiography in 1704. So a word about his relationship with William. So when the handwriting is on the wall, and Benjamin Franklin, you might ask, if he arrives in 1757, he goes back very briefly in 1762 to Philadelphia because he thinks that his work with the Penn family, the sons of William Penn, he had gotten as far as he could in getting them to support the needs of the colony, and he should be returning to Pennsylvania, which he did. But when he is there, there's a lot of talk about taxation without representation. And so Benjamin Franklin decides to return and is asked by his colony, and as I mentioned before, a number of others, to come back to London and see what he can do in terms of finding a peaceful resolution between the interests of the crown and the interests of the colony. When he is reaching 1774, when Franklin is in trouble, having come clean with the fact that he leaked some letters, he had a crown duty, Benjamin Franklin, in addition to the things that he was doing in London, which was to be the postmaster for the colonies. And of course, in the United States, Benjamin Franklin is credited with inventing and starting so many different institutions like the State Department, but also the US Postal Service. He leaked some letters which were written by the last royal governor of Massachusetts, which was saying that the people in Massachusetts had a tendency to become quite unruly, and that it might be necessary at some point to send in the troops. So Benjamin Franklin sent those letters back to Boston, never revealing who the source was. And of course, he said to Samuel Adams and the other Sons of Liberty, don't publish these letters, but they were agitating toward revolution, and this really enabled and furthered their cause, so they printed them immediately. And there was a duel back in London between one person accusing another of having leaked these letters, but finally, in Christmas of 1773, Christmas Day, Benjamin Franklin writes to one of the local papers, I am the person who leaked these letters, but I won't tell you what the source was, ever good at keeping secrets. But it leads to a trial in the House of Commons, ostensibly about removing the man, Thomas Hutchinson, who had wrote those letters, but instead it becomes a trial of Benjamin Franklin. And as an aside, one of my favorite stories about Benjamin Franklin, because he was a master with his pen, but he was not an orator. And one of his friends said during the trial in the House of Commons, why didn't you say anything in your own defense? And he said, well, they were throwing up so much mud, I thought I would wait until it dried and then, just brushed it off. But Benjamin Franklin, shortly after that trial in the summer of 1774, is writing to his son, William, things for me are not going well, and we're going to have to come to a moment when we decide which side we are on. And of course, we don't know where William was born. He might have been born in the United Kingdom, like his father had been. His father had been as a young man who came at 19 years old, before he came as this eminence grise, having had the colonial equivalent of a bestseller in Poor Richard's Almanac. But whether he was born in the colonies, William, his son, or in England, Franklin pressed upon him that he was an American son and that he should leave his post as governor of New Jersey. But his son writes back to him that his father, Benjamin, is asking him to do something quite treasonous. So he demurs, and it leads to a tremendous breach in Franklin's life, because he and his son are never fully reconciled, and they only see each other once when Franklin is leaving Paris after having served 8 years during the Revolution. And then that being said, it was not a private meeting. But when Franklin is writing the second part of his autobiography, he is still in that mode of trying to tell stories about his youth, because they might be of interest to his ancestors to come, but also to the general public at large. Now, he never finished the autobiography, but he progressed it beyond what he had done at Twyford. So he's writing this in Passy, in France, where he was representing as the kind of first US ambassador. of the fledgling United States, and he had an important role that he was playing in Paris, which was to try and convince the French, which he succeeded in doing, to support the cause of the revolution. So in this chapter, chapter 9, he has his plan for attaining moral perfection. So he says, it was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into, as I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong. I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. So what were the 13 virtues? They were temperance, which is, he kind of fleshed out these. So temperance meant eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence is the second one. Speak not to what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversations. 3 was order. Let all things have their place. Let each part of your business have its time. 4, resolution, and this is my absolute favorite Benjamin Franklin quote, and I've used it in all of my years with Benjamin Franklin as the founding director of Benjamin Franklin House. Resolve to perform what you ought and perform without fail what you resolve. Next up was frugality, make no expense but to do good to others or yourself, that is, waste nothing. Industry, lose no time, be always employed in something useful, cut off all unnecessary actions. Then there was sincerity, use no hurtful deceit, think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly. And then justice, wrong none by doing injuries or omitting the benefits that are your duty. Moderation, avoid extremes, forbear resenting injuries as much as you think they deserve. Cleanliness, tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. Then tranquility, be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unaffordable. Just a personal side note, just before I undertook signing into this conference call, one of my 2 little boys came running up the cream carpet to my office where I am right now, covered in mud, and I'm going to have to remember, be not disturbed at trifles and accidents as I later go to try to clean that up. Cleanliness also comes into something here. Chastity, rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. And then finally, humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates. So spare a thought for D.H. Lawrence, who found Franklin to be somewhat insufferable for his rags to riches story and for his striving at moral perfection and his preaching at us. But actually, I think D.H. Lawrence loses some of the humility, in fact, in Franklin's approach to these. So what Franklin says is, my intention being to acquire the habitude of all these virtues, I judged it would be well not to distract my attention by attempting the whole at once, but to fix it on one of them at a time, and when I should master of that, then to proceed to another, and so on, till I should have gone through the 13. And as the previous acquisition of some might facilitate the acquisition of certain others, I arranged them with that view. So there was temperance first, as it tends, he said, to procure that coolness and cleanliness of head, which is so necessary where constant vigilance was to be kept up and guard maintained against the unremitting attraction of ancient habits and the force of perpetual temptation. So Franklin felt a strong pull to temptation, like the rest of us. He said, this being acquired and established, he would go on to the next one, which was silence. He said that would be more easy, and my desire being to gain knowledge at the same time that I improved in virtue, and considering that in conversation it was obtained rather by the use of the ears than of the tongue, and therefore wishing to break a habit I was getting into of prattling, punning, and joking, which only made me acceptable to trifling company, I gave silence the second place. He goes on to say, this and the next order I expected will allow me more time for attending to my project and my studies. Resolution, once becoming habitual, would keep me firm in my endeavors to obtain all the subsequent virtues. Then frugality and industry, freeing me from my remaining debt and producing affluence and independence, would make more easy the practice of sincerity and justice, etc., etc., etc. So he says that he made a little book in which he allotted a page for each of the virtues. He says, I ruled each page with red ink so as to have 7 columns, one for each day of the week, marking each column with a letter for the day. I crossed these columns with 13 red lines, marking the beginning of each line with the first letter of one of the virtues, on which line and in its proper column I might mark by a little black spot every fault I found upon examination to have committed respecting the virtue upon that day. So you see here he's focusing on the first one, and this he's telling us, I guess he did fairly well on temperance. That was easier, but he struggled on a Sunday and a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday with silence and then order subsequently. So he said he was determined to give a week's strict attention to each of the virtues successively. Thus, he says, in the first week, my great guard was to avoid the least offense against temperance, leaving the other virtues to their ordinary chance, only marking every evening the faults of the day. Thus, if in the first week I could keep my first line marked T clear of spots, I suppose that the habit of that virtue so much strengthened and its opposite weakened that I might venture extending my attention to include the next, and for the following week keep both lines clear of spots. Proceeding thus to the last, I could go through a course complete in 13 weeks and 4 courses in a year. And like him, who having a garden to weed, does not attempt to eradicate all the bad herbs at once, which would exceed his reach and his strength, but works on one of the beds at a time, and having accomplished the first, proceeds to a second. So I should have, I hoped, the encouraging pleasure of seeing on my pages the progress I made in virtue by clearing successively my lines of their spots, till in the end, by a number of courses, I should be happy in viewing a clean book after a 13 weeks daily examination. This, my little book, had for its motto these lines from Addison's Cato. So he puts this in the autobiography. He says, here will I hold, if there's a power above us, and that there is, all nature cries aloud, though through all her works, he must delight in virtue, and that which he delights in must be happy. Okay, so what came of this big project? He says that he had entered upon the execution of this plan for self-examination and continued with it occasional intermissions for some time. He says, I was surprised to find myself so much fuller of faults than I imagined, but I had the satisfaction of seeing them diminish. To avoid the trouble of renewing now and then my little book, which by scraping out the marks on the paper of old faults to make room for new ones in new course, became full of holes. I transferred my tables and precepts to the ivory leaves of a memorandum book on which the lines were drawn with red ink that made a durable stain, and on those lines I marked my faults with a black lead pencil, which marks I could easily wipe out with a wet sponge. After a while, I went through one course only in a year, and afterward, only one in several years, till at length I omitted them entirely, being employed in voyages and business abroad, with a multiplicity of affairs that interfered, but I always carried my little book with me. So what about this for us? And I go on here to a picture. It's among my favorites of Benjamin Franklin. It's a Joseph Duplessis portrait that Franklin sat for for Duplessis when he was in Passy. So this was completed in 1778, and there are many versions of this portrait, and here's but one. So, what for us in terms of these virtues? And I think my colleague Caitlin Hoffman, the operations manager for Benjamin Franklin House, is going to help us so that you can chime in with your thoughts about this program. But I think in the current context in which we find ourselves, this horrific COVID-19 crisis, it seems that there's a lot to remember, particularly as much of the world is in lockdown, in terms of frugality. Franklin noted, when the well's dry, we know the worth of water. And that's an important quote, I think. When the well's dry, we know the worth of water. While Franklin was exposed to grandeur during his time in London, he chose 36 Craven Street's kind of humble lodgings. They were comfortable but simple for the better part of those 16 years that I was describing at the beginning of my talk. And in his rooms, he installed a fuel-efficient stove with the aim of gaining more heat from less fuel. And so in his time in London in the 18th century, and his dates in London, so were 1757 to 1762, and then 1764 until he returns in 1775 as the first shots are being fired in Lexington and Concord. So he was interested in sustainable consumption, and I'm very mindful of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of which one is SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production. And we've seen, as we have taken to our homes, that carbon emissions have decreased by some measures, anticipated 25% or more will be the case during the course of this year. So the capacity to be ratcheting down some of the impact that we have on the natural world is possible, and will it be sustainable when the world returns to normal? And in some of that, I'm mindful of resolution. I think that when you look at the fact that many of us make resolutions on New Year's or in and around that time, but according to John Norcross, who's a clinical psychologist, he has said that as many as 60% of us don't follow through with the resolutions that we in fact make. So there's a lot now that's being asked of us by our employers, or in terms of the family commitments that we need to have, or in terms of staying at home, staying safe, and resolving to ensure that we do that. And that's very difficult, especially when we have loved ones that we're not able to visit, or just the need to be social as humans, which we are. So there's certainly at this time, I think, a lot of resolution that we need to expect of ourselves and hopefully follow through with. Industry, what does that mean? Again, in the period that we find ourselves, Benjamin Franklin, when he was living at Craven Street, wrote a small pamphlet called The Way to Wealth, where he said industry, by which he meant useful activity, gives comfort and plenty. So in some of the things that I've been reading, people have been dusting off books that they had long meant to read, or cleaning off shelves that they long meant to clean. But certainly, the impact of the coronavirus on the global economy is quite striking, and we'll definitely be needing to stay the course in hoping that the when the crisis lifts and we are able to resume activity, that we do so indeed in a sustainable way, but in a way that will help with the resumption of jobs and helping to drive forward the economy after being shut down in the way that it unexpectedly and unprecedentedly has been. And maybe just a few more tranquility. What Franklin said in terms of finding our still places, and some of this has been thrust upon us, but it's an opportunity, hopefully, for reflection in a way that in the course of our normal lives we don't always have the chance to pursue. And then in terms of sincerity, I think we've seen a huge outpouring of the goodness of humanity at this time, and I think that is a positive note to end on, and I hope that it will continue not only during the crisis, but this kind of focus on what is really important and what really matters will give us pause after the virus begins to recede. So I think those are the things that I wanted to share. And maybe, Caitlin, you can tell us how I can hear views from any of the people who are on the line today.
Yes, hello. So thank you very much, Marcia, for this talk. So we're now opening the floor to questions. You have two options. You can either send us a question through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or if you'd like to speak and ask your question personally, you can raise your hand and I will call on you. So we already have a first question in the Q&A. And it's, where did Franklin get the inspiration for the template of moral perfection as he practiced it and the selection of the 13 virtues?
Well, he does say that he, in the introduction to the program, that he was interested in the ancients and what advice they had. So he says that conceiving then that agreeably to the advice of Pythagoras in his golden verses, daily examination would be necessary, that he contrived the following method for conducting that examination. So Franklin was an avid reader, and in fact, in his autobiography, he talks about that first part of it that he wrote in 1771, that he would read The Spectator as a child, and would try and practice the writing and see if he could emulate that kind of clarity of thought. But he was an avid reader, and I think some of that kind of came through in his desire to look at these virtues. And it could be, he talks about earlier, again, the 13 virtues, he's writing when he's 79 years old. So, he's already lived a life. But he's this is his older self remembering this program. And, he might not have been the picture of moral virtue when he was, for example, that 19-year-old in London. I think he was having a grand time consorting with all different types. And he said that, he intimates that he was drinking too much and probably carousing with friends that might not have been the best, and probably participating in low pursuits. So maybe he was feeling that, that it was time to think about how he could improve his behavior. At least that was his recollection. Now, he says that he did this as a young man, but it's hard to tell exactly when he did it, but he did have a strong sense of the importance of making a civic contribution. I mean, why is he so well known in the United States, besides, and around the world for that matter? Why is he so well known? And when we think about the fact that, of course, he's on the $100 bill, but he set up one of the first hospitals, the Pennsylvania Hospital, one of the first universities, often with colleagues. That university became University of Pennsylvania, or the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first lending library in America, the first fire insurance company, et cetera, et cetera. So he it could be a combination of trying to address his personal flaws, and in a way, that's what I like about Benjamin Franklin, is that unlike this figure from history that is kind of untouchable and perfect, he's kind of deeply flawed like the rest of us.
Okay, great. The next question we have is, do you think Franklin ever made it all the way down to humility?
Well, he says he did. We don't know how many times, if he ran that course in the first year of doing it. But yeah, you do have to wonder. He did have a strong sense of himself, and I think maybe he says that the 13 of the 13 virtues, the one that he struggled the most was with order. Apparently, it was quite messy, or didn't always organize his thoughts or his activities in as clear a way as he might have. But actually, and he writes about this at other points, that he struggled with humility. He was smart, and he knew it, and he knew everything that he had achieved. And when we think back to that introduction of him saying that you might want to know something about my background, ostensibly to his family members, but as I said before, really to all of us, because it might be instructive to you. So he did have a strong sense of his own moral authority.
Great. So the next question is, what is Franklin's most important contribution to UK-US relations, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, we like to think that Benjamin Franklin was the kind of architect of the so-called special relationship between Britain and America. We've seen that play out in all kinds of ways. The strong trade between the two countries, over the last 100 years, but also in more potentially amusing ways in recent days, where the American president didn't ban flights from the UK when the kind of lockdown was beginning to happen in the United States. Eventually, of course, after a few days, he did. But I think there's a strong sense that we, as Britons and as Americans, and I'm both, that we share kind of a common connection, of course, when we were one, and that there is this relationship that exists between the two. And if you look at some of the U.S. coverage in recent days, and we wish the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson the best of health and the quickest recovery possible. How much coverage Johnson's illness has captured the interest of people in America. So there's a kind of strong feeling that we're connected. And if you look at the Treaty of Paris, which ends the Revolutionary War, one of the people sent to negotiate with Benjamin Franklin, again, is another footnote in history, a gentleman named Caleb Whiteford. Whiteford had been Benjamin Franklin's neighbor when he lived on Craven Street. He was a very successful wine merchant who also had political dealings, and he was sent by the British to help negotiate the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Revolutionary War. And, Benjamin Franklin, when you look at the notes, his grandsons, one of his grandsons served as his scribe when he was in Paris, and they all sort of eagerly await the arrival of Mr. Whiteford, because they're going to have a celebratory dinner. This is after so much strife and death that was a hallmark of the Revolutionary War. So he was able to maintain friendships during the war, including with Polly. So he's writing her from Passy. So Polly, if you remember the character on our historical experience, the daughter of his landlady, Margaret Stevenson, who married the young surgeon, William Hewson. Hewson dissects cadavers as part of the anatomy school that he's running from Craven Street. So it was a very lively place to be. But actually one of the saddest letters that he writes in 1774, which was not a good year, not least because of the trial, but most importantly for the death of Polly's husband. So she was pregnant with a daughter and she had 2 young sons. And when Franklin is in France, he's writing to Polly to say, well, why don't you bring the children? Come, we will be a family again together. And she says, well, it's not the right time. I can't do that until the war is completely over. But of course, all of her descendants become American because of Franklin. So he was able to maintain those relationships, but yet the complexity of Benjamin Franklin, he could do that, but yet he couldn't maintain and could not forgive his own son for crossing him and telling his father that he was a traitor. And in fact, Franklin had the last laugh, maybe in a number of ways, with his son William, in that in his will, he left his son his papers, but he didn't leave him cash. And he said, no more than William had to try to deprive him of. And poor William was removed from his post at the State House in New Jersey. He was imprisoned in Connecticut, and then he was exiled to Britain. And when he dies, he's buried at St. Pancras Old Church, just behind the modern day St. Pancras Station. And when Charing Cross Station, when St. Pancras Station is being expanded in the late 1800s, a lot of those graves, including William Franklin, Franklin's son, is kind of dug up, and those bodies are buried in a mass grave somewhere on the site of St. Pancras Old Church. So we don't actually, his remains are sort of there but lost. So it's a kind of sad story. So he's a man of complexity.
The next question we have is, did Franklin ever advertise his system of virtues before writing his autobiography?
Not that I'm aware, no.
And then friend of the house, George Goodwin, would like to know, what is your favorite Franklin saying?
Oh, well, that's the one that I mentioned before, but it's so good. And in fact, I can kind of tell you a personal anecdote, which is that our current chairman of Benjamin Franklin House is John Studzinski, who is a great patron of the arts and also a great business leader, currently vice chairman of PIMCO. My previous chair, I've only had 2, was Sir Bob Reed, our chairman emeritus. And when I was writing to him and one of the board members, his wife, Lady Joan Reed, I wrote my letter when I had heard about the fact that there was something called Benjamin Franklin House, which was a derelict 18th century building that they wanted to open as a museum and educational facility. And I said at the top of my letter, that I would resolve to perform what I ought, which would be opening Benjamin Franklin House, and to perform that without fail. And I guess the fact that I've been involved for 20 years must be a good example of that. And Caitlin, don't we have anyone who wants to say anything live?
Yes, one moment. I'm going to call on Eleanor Hamblin. Go ahead.
Hello? Hi, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Marcia, for that talk. My question relates to the opening of the autobiography and the part where he's saying that he thinks readers might learn from his example, where he does seem to be setting himself up as a role model, even if he's hopeful that people will learn from his errors as well as his successes. Do you think he had a particular audience in mind for those lessons? Or do you think he was thinking the lessons from his life would be quite universal?
I think, going back to what I said before about him being the ultimate 18th century PR guru, that, he had a sense that, if he wrote something down and if he shared that it would be something that his heirs and members of the public would be able to have access to, and it might actually be useful to them. Whether he expected that in the year 2020 we would still be talking about him and his 13 virtues, probably not. But I think it's quite interesting. Just what if he looks down, assuming that there, he's above or in the ether, then surely he must be very pleased. There's a kind of cottage industry around Benjamin Franklin. I mean, look, those of us associated with Benjamin Franklin House and the other Franklin institutions, like the American Philosophical Society, which is Franklin founded, a prestigious organization for academic knowledge, or this U.S. State Department, whatever it might be, that there are many who remember Franklin on an ongoing basis, whether that's because they're wearing a Franklin and Marshall t-shirt, or someone in a film is saying, show me the Benjamins. I don't know, how much time do we have, Caitlin?
We probably have time for one more question. So I'm just going to pick one. Nobody else has raised their hand, but I'll just pick from the list that we have. Franklin was a creative man. How do you think he would react to the constraints we are living under today? Do you think he might have invented ways of living well under these conditions that would last after the constraints are lifted?
Well, I'm thinking about, the issue around frugality and living sustainably. The one thing that, I see is that if someone had said to us even 2 months ago how the world would have changed, it would have been difficult for us to comprehend or believe that that was possible. But yet our ability to do what's best for the good of humanity and ourselves is huge. And so I'm hopeful that this ability to transform the way that we live, and in this time of terrible tragedy and crisis, that there is some silver lining in the fact, whether that's on the for the environment, and the fact that carbon emissions have been reduced, or I was reading that the Yangtze River in India for the first time would be of a suitable quality for fishing and bathing. That's pretty incredible. If we can take this resolve to the other one that I mentioned in terms of resolution, and apply that, I think this would be a good outcome, and I would hope that that would be something that is instructive, that Benjamin Franklin would have chosen for his own life. And he lived during a time of upheaval and war, and a lack of plenty, and he made a success of his life. So much so, as I was saying before, that we're still talking about him today. But I hope that for me, the glass is always more than half full. It's just that the part that isn't, often gets better press. But I think the kind of goodness that we've seen in this collective will globally to help others and to do what's best for our local communities and more broadly will continue past the current moment that we are in. But Caitlin, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for all of you who have joined. I think we will be making the recording available and putting it on our website and our YouTube channel. And Caitlin, I don't know if you have anything to say about future talks.
Yes, so next week we will be having Wendy Moore, who is one of our Distinguished Literary Prize judges. She will be speaking about her new book. And then the week after that, it'll be our House Education Manager, Eleanor Hamblin. It will all be on Wednesdays. Times varied, but we will update everything on our social media.
Thank you. Bye-bye.